Well, firstly, just to introduce myself. So I'm Mark Stewart at the University of Leeds. I'm the co-director of DIGIT, the Digital Futures at Work Research Centre, with Jackie O'Reilly at the University of Sussex. And DIGIT is a major investment by the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK. So I'm very pleased to introduce Juliet Schor to today's DIGIT Debates session. Juliet's an economist by training and is currently a professor of sociology at Boston College. There's far too much in Juliet's bio and CV to detail by way of introduction, but I'm sure we're all familiar with Juliet's work. She's a prolific author and has published a number of well-received and best-selling books, including The Overworked American, The Overspent American, Plenitude, The New Economics of Time Wealth, and of course, most recently, the last couple of months, actually, After the Gig, How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked and How to Win It Back. So a nice plug for your book, Juliet, and hopefully some colleagues will go out and buy it after today's session. So Juliet's going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll take some questions. And the title of today's talk is What Do Platforms Do? Beyond the Pro-Con Debate in Gig Labor. So Juliet, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, and wonderful to be here. I really appreciate the invitation, and in part because so much of the really pioneering and very important and interesting work on the gig economy has been done by researchers in the UK. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk with you all today. Let me just pull the slides up, and this is the cover of the book. And today I'm going to focus on the question, what do platforms do beyond the pro-con debate on gig labor? And some of this comes from an article that I published this year with Steve Vallis at Northeastern University, who's a labor scholar. Okay, so let me just start with what I've called the idealist discourse, and that's the way the sharing economy or the platform economy launched, and that is that it launched with a series of common good claims around economic, social, and environmental impacts. And I'm going to focus on the economic today, but thought I would just mention this. This is an ad from early days when Airbnb, an accommodations platform, was trying to get the New York City government off its back. It put up these ads, and it argued that Airbnb was good for everyone. Its discourse and that of many platform apps emerged out of Silicon Valley and are kind of an updated form of cyber utopianism. The idea that these new technologies would lead to all these wonderful egalitarian, democratic, and positive outcomes. Obviously, things have turned out differently. On the economic side, it promised a new way to work without bosses and with freedom, income for struggling middle classes, and entrepreneurial opportunity. It promised to build social capital via peer-to-peer exchanges and to reduce carbon and eco footprints. Well, the very first day that the ads went up, they were defaced all around the city by people critical of Airbnb. And here you see the shared economy is a lie. And I think we need to ask the question, has this been a failed agenda? Environmental impacts have mostly been negative, social connection pretty spotty. And the issue that I'm going to focus on today, which is labor conditions, one of the things we see is the deterioration over time of conditions on these platforms, growing worker unrest and dissatisfaction. And I've called this the sharing economy hijack. And we want to ask the question, how did we go from the idealist discourse and the win-win-win narrative of the early days to Uber drivers sleeping in their cars because they can't afford accommodation, Instacart horrors, that's a grocery shopping platform, and widespread worker unrest. We had the first global strike of ride-hail drivers on May 8th. That was a worldwide strike. Frequent Instacart strikes, and of course, a lot of contention over whether working on a platform should give one employee status, or as the current model is IC, independent contractor status, without any employment rights, minimum wages, and so forth. And there was just a massive ballot initiative in California put forward by the companies, the most money spent of any initiative in the country's history, over $200 million, in which the companies convinced California voters that they were going to be doing good things for the workers, which of course they were taking away employment rights. So we can talk more about that. The research that I'm reporting on today comes primarily from a 7-year effort funded by the MacArthur Foundation. I had a good-sized research team. These are the main researchers involved. All of them were graduate students in sociology. Most of them have now finished their degrees and moved on. And then after that project, I started a National Science Foundation project called the Algorithmic Workplace, which focuses more on the algorithms themselves and the technology of app work. And this is an interdisciplinary team with sociologists, one joint law sociology person, and engineers. And we're doing interviews on platforms, agent-based modeling. We have data from one company, and so forth. Okay, so the original MacArthur study looked at 13 platforms, and these are the platforms: Airbnb, TaskRabbit, which is a generalized errands platform; Turo, which is basically Airbnb for cars, where people rent out peer-to-peer their cars; Postmates and Favor, which are food delivery apps like Deliveroo, Foodora, Uber Eats, that basically same model; Uber and Lyft, and then a platform cooperative, which I can talk about a little bit if I have time at the end. That's a platform that is owned by the people who earn on it. And it's the one we studied is Stocksy United, which is a stock photography platform. So the earners are photographers. In the right-hand corner here, we have Amazon Prime shoppers, Instacart, grocery shoppers and deliverers. We also have some other Amazon workers, delivery, and then a smaller platform called Deliv, which was a package delivery going mostly from stores to homes and businesses. And the last column is all from the Northeastern study. So we've looked at a lot of different topics. I'm going to focus today on the labor questions, but just to let you know, we started actually, and I went through that slide very quickly just for time reasons. We started looking at nonprofits in the quote unquote sharing economy, and we did 4 studies of nonprofits. And then as these for-profit apps really started expanding, we shifted our focus to them and have pretty much tried to move with the sector. As the gig labor sector has changed, our research topics have moved along with it. That was a nice dimension of the MacArthur project, which is it pretty much had no strings attached, just money to do whatever we wanted. So we studied cultural aspects, the culture of Airbnb hosting, the moral aspirations of participants. We've done a lot of work on racial discrimination, gentrification on Airbnb, race and ratings, reputation systems. The efficacy of regulation is a subject we're looking at now. We're also starting a project on greenhouse gases and Airbnb. The Airbnb work is all big data. So we have a data set of Airbnb across the country. The other research is interview-based. Uber and Lyft drivers and vulnerability, systems of labor control and delivery apps, and that gets to today's. And then with Steve Vallis, we've now completed 2 annual review of sociology pieces, the one on gig labor that I talked about, and one which will be coming out next year on the sharing economy. So now on to what do platforms do beyond the pro-con debate. And just, you know, in terms of that subtitle, one of the things that is characteristic of the literature in the United States, I think to some extent in Europe as well, is a lot of the discussion, particularly in the more in the press, has been about, you know, are these apps good or are they bad? And that's a very important discussion. But in some ways, it overshadowed more analytical work asking, well, how should we understand them? What do they really do? And that's what I want to talk about now. So in the literature, I would argue there have been 4 major approaches. The first comes from economists and to a certain extent management schools. And this focuses on the efficiencies that are possible as a result with these apps and the sort of possibilities of entrepreneurialism. And the 2 key dimensions of these efficiencies are the matching algorithms, which are used by nearly all the apps, although for some of them, they don't make the matches themselves. They just give the search results to the consumers or the workers, depending on the app, and crowdsourced information. And what's really key about these new technologies, or the use of these technologies, is that they solve many of the long-standing problems of what we can call peer-to-peer or person-to-person markets. So they address issues of reputation and quality. They address issues of search costs. And so the idea here in this literature, and I think there's a lot to this, is that they open up these new kinds of structures, these peer-to-peer structures, in ways that were not possible before. So we have had peer-to-peer markets, obviously, all along, but they've remained rather small and kind of marginal and sort of second best kind of alternatives. But what we see with these new technologies is peer-to-peer markets becoming really efficient and possible and sort of desirable on a large scale. You know, one of the key things about peer-to-peer markets, of course, is what I've called stranger sharing. So people are sharing with others that they don't know, and that's where the quality and reputational dimensions become so important. So the economists argue you have reduced management costs because a lot of what management does typically is automated through algorithms and other systems. You get enhanced efficiency in logistics. So for ride hail and delivery, you can get optimal routes. You avoid what are called wild goose chases in the ride hail area. You know, drivers are running around looking for customers. Lower search costs for consumers, greater possibility for self-employment, reduces risks of peer-to-peer exchange, as I said, through that crowdsourced information, and efficient payment systems. So the economists predict that you'll get a reduction in the scale of activity, so many more very small businesses as a result. The second major approach in the literature comes from a much more critical place. We called it the algorithmic manager. And this is the idea that it's also a technological argument. It's about how algorithms change things. And it argues that the algorithms have become the new managers. So they control all aspects of the labor process. They're problematic because they don't have human contact. There are arbitrary decisions. Asymmetric information between the platform and the worker yields systemic power over workers. So this is a critical argument coming from sociologists, legal scholars, and so forth, arguing that the setup here is very problematic for workers because they have less information, which gives the platform more control. And people also emphasize what we might call the informational panopticon, the idea that the algorithms can scoop up all this data about workers, which can then be used against them, also data about consumers that's used to engage in discriminatory pricing and so forth. So the algorithmic manager and the economist's view both focus on the technology, and they both see platforms as something pretty new, a break from the past. The third approach pretty much doesn't even think about the technology. Well, I mean, that's an exaggeration, but it focuses on the institutional arrangements of the work. And this is work in the sort of precarious labor tradition. And this is something that we've, has been going on for a long time. Economists started working on this, I remember, back in the 1980s, possibly, actually even in the 70s, you had some of this going on. And it's this idea that you've got a long-term shift in global north countries away from the stable employment regime of the post-war era to a precarious regime. Of course, Guy Standing famously called it the precariat. But this approach it really doesn't focus on the technology. It focuses on the fact of new institutional arrangements and the shift to independent contracting, with all of the risk shifting on, or nearly all the risk shifting onto the workers, and the platforms taking on very, very little risk. The issue of misclassification, that these really should be employees, but they're being classified as independent contractors as a way for the platform to avoid the risk. Neoliberalism on steroids. So this is a kind of hyper precarity. So a key feature of this approach is it emphasizes continuity with the past as opposed to a radical break, and it doesn't locate the core of the platform in the technology. It locates it in the institutional arrangements. Okay, so there's one final one I didn't mention. I'll just very quickly say there's a small literature which looks comparatively, particularly between the US and Europe, which basically argues these platforms are really chameleons, and it matters. They're different depending on the institutional configuration in which they are embedded, and you really shouldn't think of them as a thing in themselves. Uber gets banned in one place, it's allowed to do anything it wants in another. That's really the difference, that regulatory context. So we argued for, obviously, all of these approaches have virtues and strengths and insights. They also have limitations. We argue that there's the right way to think about what's going on with platforms is that they represent a hybrid labor regime made possible by technology, but it's not only the technology that's different. And the key aspect here is the shift from what I've called the retreat from control. If we think about the conventional workplace model in the post-World War II period, the employer controls hours and the labor process. And of course, here we have a factory with very regimented work, supervision, high levels of control. The management organizes the labor process, and people are doing these very small tasks. So technology matters, labor policy matters. With the platform model, the employer cedes control over hours, scheduling, and some aspects of the labor process. And I would argue this, or I have argued, this is really important and something that has been really not sufficiently emphasized in the literature on platforms. part of the reason is that people have focused on whether or not the workers have de facto control over their schedules. And people have argued, well, Uber says people can control their schedules, but to make a living on these platforms, you lose control. And I'll talk about that in a minute. It's a fair point. But the basic model is one that's very different than a conventional employer, both because the employer is not controlling hours, is not controlling schedules, is not controlling many aspects of the labor process. If you think about the difference between a typical service sector job, and here we're talking about service sector, these are person-to-person services for the most part. We're talking about, McDonald's versus a platform labor job, where McDonald's, every aspect of the service encounter is scripted. Workers have a lot more control over the way they do the work here. And the last point is that they greatly reduce barriers to entry. So almost anybody can join these platforms. So what does that imply? Well, one thing is it implies a lot more diversity in the labor force than the conventional model. So you get a lot of heterogeneity in who comes into the labor force. And what we have found is there's one particular kind of heterogeneity, which is really important. So this is what I've just gone over. The first part, retreat from control. Notice how different this view is from the algorithmic manager view, which says it's enhanced control. So we're talking about moving back in terms of levels of control. Platforms are open access, meaning anyone can join that heterogeneous labor force. So how do platforms how are they able to extract labor from labor power, to use the Marxist formulation? How do they get workers to do what they want? And the answer there is the combination of market discipline. So they've really opened up this, the labor relationship to the discipline of the market and technology. So the rating systems and so forth. And to think about the market discipline, I want to introduce the concept that we think is really crucial in understanding the analytics of platforms, and that is platform dependence. And just to make this last point on the slide here, which is that I think part of why we came to this view is that we had a multi-platform study, so we could see how platforms were managing labor across a number of different platforms, in contrast to what I've called Uber centricity in the literature, because people focus so much on Uber. Of course, it makes sense. It's the largest platform, but they are a much more controlling platform than many others. Okay, so quickly, we have this MacArthur sample. These were in-depth interviews. I'm going to talk about a sample of 111 earners on 7 platforms: Airbnb, TaskRabbit, Turo, which is, it also was called Relay Rides, food delivery, Postmates, Favor, then Uber and Lyft. And then at the end, if I have time, I'll go to the Instacart, Amazon, and Deliv. So the key finding, what we call platform dependence. Workers who are wholly or primarily dependent on the platform for their livelihood, who rely on earnings to pay for their monthly expenses, roughly equivalent to full-time workers, but it's not actually full-time workers. These are, the key thing is the level of dependence on the platform to pay their basic expenses. Partially dependent, pretty obvious what that means. Somewhat, they work on multiple platforms or have other forms of income. And then supplemental workers, platform earnings are not part of their regular income source, are considered extra or supplemental. Many have full-time employment or activity. And we asked questions about this on our survey, the follow-up survey, and then in the interviews. So you can see here, this is the classification of our survey, of our sample across these 3. It varies a lot by platform. We didn't have any dependent Airbnb hosts. Drivers are much more dependent. 3/4 of our Uber and Lyft drivers were dependents. So we had about 42 supplementals, 42%, 32 partially dependents, and about 25% fully dependent. And that is pretty consistent with where the survey data, what the survey data has found across multiple apps in Europe and North America at the time we were doing this research. On ride hail and food delivery, the fraction of dependents, I think, has risen. But generally speaking, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 typically who are full-timers. Again, in some of the big cities, the ride hail and to a lesser extent, the food delivery has also moved in that direction. So I think I'll just have time to go through one or two of these, but here are the differences between supplemental and dependent workers. And I'm going to start with TaskRabbit. It's an errands platform. We did a lot of interviews on it. Supplemental earners tend to get good wages. So on this platform, people could earn between, $25 an hour is about a bottom level, up to sometimes $150 an hour. Strong non-pecuniary benefits. People reported to us enjoying the work, alleviating boredom. They were able to get high wages by being selective about the jobs they took. They could avoid unsafe or problematic jobs, so things that looked a little sketchy. They did retain flexibility and autonomy. They used these earnings to reduce precarity as opposed to being precarious workers. Some of them use this platform to avoid less desirable low-end sort of dead-end work, catering, work with bosses, unpleasant bosses, and some manage a portfolio of earnings. By contrast, if you are a dependent worker, even on TaskRabbit, which is one of the highest wage apps for people with just generalized skills, you could get high hourly wages, but inadequate demand led to poverty incomes. So none of our people were earning more than $20,000 a year as a full-time TaskRabbit. They lost flexibility on autonomy because they had to take jobs. It yielded more wage jeopardy, worse conditions of work because they sort of would take jobs that would, or have to stay in jobs that weren't going so well. And we also found a downward trajectory over time for their experiences. And this is something that we see on virtually all of the platforms. The conditions are really great at the beginning, and then over time, as a combination of more competition for jobs and also more pressure from the companies, conditions get worse. Supplemental earnings, Postmates and Favor, reasonable extra money. People love the exercise, the non-pecuniary aspects, and not much worry about ratings. A story I love is one of our Postmates workers, a married woman who just had a baby. She and her husband were doing a lot of different apps, reasonably professional jobs. I think she was a teacher as well. And when she would work at night, she'd go in her car, she'd have the baby with her, and she would refuse to get out of her car and to deliver the food. And she would make the customer come down to her car to get the food. And this is, of course, a complete violation of the terms of what she was supposed to be doing, but she didn't care. If Postmates was going to fire her, they were going to fire her. She was doing it her way. So the ability to do the work in the way that the earner wants to, relatively high for supplemental earners. Of course, a very different story for the dependent earners. These food delivery jobs were kind of the job of last resort. People would go to them after, when their car was no longer eligible to drive for Uber or Lyft. Bottom of the ladder, very erratic demand only at certain times of day. These people worried about their ratings, much more vulnerability to weather and traffic, and a kind of wage autonomy trade-off where they could get a guaranteed wage for a shift, but they lost the ability to choose. So you have the same kind of thing with Uber and Lyft, and you've probably heard a lot of the really horror stories about dependent workers on Lyft. And Uber in debt, very worried about their ratings, constant changing conditions on the platform, long hours, loss of control of schedule. Our supplemental earners on Uber and Lyft love it. It's just extra money. Sometimes they just, pick up riders on their way to work. etc., financing leisure spending. Quickly, insights from Instacart, Amazon, and Deliv. One of the, we also confirm the relevance of the supplemental dependent distinction and whether or not this work is mitigating or accelerating precarity, depending on whether people are supplemental or dependents. The new findings very quickly are, number one, overhiring by platforms, great difficulty for workers to get tasks and shifts. So not the platforms, because of the open access, and also they did a lot of recruiting as a result of the pandemic, leading to a dissatisfaction by the workers, racial animosity around work availability as ethnic minorities joined the platform, and a big worker squeeze on Instacart, which is like Uber, one of the really predatory platforms. One last point before I finish, and that is we have a paper that's under review at the moment, and there's some discussion of this in my book. The title of the paper is Homo varians, meaning different kind of economic actors. And what we found is 3 different earner orientations on these platforms, in addition to basically allowing this wide range of how much people work and how often they work, that diversity or heterogeneity that I talked about earlier. The platforms also make it possible for people to have different orientations to the work. So we have here 3. HE is Homo economicus, your typical well-known rational actor, optimizing, maximizing. So these are people who are just out to basically make as much money as they can for any given level of work. What we call Homo instrumentalis, which are people who are a little bit more target earners. They just have a certain amount they need to earn, and they work to that. And then a 3rd category, which we call Homo socialis, so social earners, people who put either they're there for sociability, or, which is one thing, or they put boundaries on the way they work. They have status boundaries or social, ethical, moral boundaries, etc. So they're not maximizers. They're there for reasons. They're all there to earn money, but they're also there for other reasons, and I can talk more about that. So I'm going to skip over the cooperatives. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Final point, platform labor analytics. We argue it's a new type of labor regime with high heterogeneity across numerous dimensions. Technology is key, but you really also need to think about the political economic factors and the disciplining role of the labor market. There are ways to make these platforms very desirable and positive for workers, because they can offer high levels of autonomy and freedom, but not for heavily dependent workers. And I think if we are going to, if we do want to think about how to improve these platforms, obviously regulation is a key dimension of that, and there's been a lot more of that in the United States since 2018. But then also worker-owned platforms, and our study of the worker-owned platform found very, very satisfied earners there. So let me stop there and open it up for questions.
Okay, Juliet, thank you very much for that fascinating talk. So just to inform colleagues again that we're taking questions in 2 ways. You can either type the question into the Q&A box, or you can put your hand up. Some questions have come through, and I will give colleagues the opportunity to ask the question directly if they want. So Karina, I see that you've put 2 questions. So would you like to present the questions to Juliet?
Hi, hi Juliet. Thanks for a really interesting talk. I popped 2 questions in there, but I'll start with the first one, which was that you mentioned at the very beginning of your presentation that the environmental impacts have been mostly very negative. I was just wondering if you could expand on that a bit to explain more, please.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a pretty simple answer. Many of the arguments about why these platforms would be great for the environment rested on what we can think of as first round effects. So Airbnb, for example, said, oh, we're not going to have to build as many hotels. And Uber and Lyft said people are going to share rides. And so people are going to give up their cars. And and then you have also a whole range of platforms which are around the recirculation of goods. And those were thought to also be, footprint reducing, people reusing goods and so forth. The two biggest platforms in this sector are in ride hail and accommodations. And those are both very carbon intensive activities. Ride hail, obviously, because it's driving, and accommodations because it typically involves travel. And what's pretty and the other really big thing about this sector is that it dramatically reduced prices. So the price of a ride hail, started out maybe the third of a taxi, and Airbnb started out much lower price than hotels. And so what we would expect to happen happened, which is big increase in demand. And that has big impacts. So people started moving off public transportation to take Ubers. People traveled a lot more as a result of Airbnb. That one's a little bit more contested in terms of what we know so far, but it certainly looks like it. And we heard that from our informants, and there's some survey data that shows that and so forth. So those are the really big impacts. And there've been a lot of studies now in the US of ride hailing and its impact on congestion, rising numbers of cars, numbers of miles, etc. Traffic fatalities also going up. And the third issue, the recirculation of goods, where you'd have a much greater possibility of, a much higher likelihood that it would have reduced impacts. Number one, the environmental impacts of the goods are a lot less than in transportation and travel. Number one. And number two, very few of those sites or platforms scaled. So they've been really small. Most of them have failed. So even though they probably have some positive environmental impacts, they don't really have all that much volume.
Thank you very much.
There's a section in my book on this, but it's something there's very little work on, and we are now involved in doing work on that. So stay tuned. And there's a group of researchers who are starting to get funded to do some of that work.
Okay, there's quite a lot of questions coming through, so I think I'm just going to read a few out to you, Juliet, so we can maybe try to link a few questions together. So there's a few around the dependent supplemental distinction. So a question by Carlos Alvarez. How could the gap be closed between the experience dependent and supplemental workers have? And then a question by Anna Dent. Did you find differences in the dependent, non-dependent makeup of different groups? For example, gender, ethnicity, higher or lower socioeconomic groups. So do the issues experienced by those who are highly dependent affect some groups more than others?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we didn't see it so much in our sample, but our sample is small. I mean, it's 112 or something. And it's very high. The degree of dependence also varies a lot across the platform. And we had an unbalanced sample in terms of numbers on the platform. I do think that the dependent workers tend to be somewhat lower socioeconomic status. And certainly you've seen that develop in ride hail. So some of the city studies, there have been individual city studies in some of the big cities, which find you have a lot of immigrants and a lot of people of color. And that has also happened over the period of time, over the years as the sector has grown. It has become less white. So a study of San Francisco ride-hail and food delivery workers found only about 22% white. Of course, it's a very multiracial city. It would be very different if you went to, you know, another city in the Midwest or something. But I think there is some difference there, but I wouldn't overstate it, because I mean, I think it's the main reason that where you see more commonality across is in education levels, because although that started to erode a bit, all of these workers have had pretty high education levels. And since education is an important dimension of socioeconomic status, so it's not as if there was a high educated and a low educated big gap. And then the question of how to close the gap, that's a really hard one. I mean, the push for employment status that happened in California basically that's really putting the interests of the full-time workers foremost, which I think is, you know, and that would sort of change the sector in a way that would pretty much regularize these jobs, and where it would be a lot harder to be a supplemental worker with the same kind of really marginal levels of work that you see currently in the sector. There's a lot to be said about whether that's a viable business model for the platforms. I think it is. The platform the company we've been studying actually transitioned its workers in California to employee status in advance of the law that shifted gig workers, and they had really good results. And so, you know, I'm happy if anyone wants to talk more about that. But so that's one question. Like, do you want these jobs? Do you want these platforms to create stable, good jobs for people? I think there's a strong argument to be made for that in an environment in which there's not enough work, and the economy, you need to be creating jobs. On the other hand, the model itself, I think, is very interesting and appealing, to have a sector of the economy where people really have the freedom to come in and out and work as much or as little as they want and so forth. And certainly many workers on these platforms say that flexibility is really key to why they're there. So I think, to answer your question, we got to back up and say, well, what is your goal here? And if you had a world in which people had a UBI that they could live on, or which there was full employment, you know, it would be a different answer than one in which there's real job scarcity.
Okay, there's a question from Brendan Birchall about the generalizability of your model. Brendan, would you like to put the question to Juliet?
I can read it, actually.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So, can your model be generalized to other areas of the labor market? For instance, all 0 hours contracts, where there's also a big difference between the powerful supplemental workers and the low power dependent workers?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that the question, the sort of the key, the core of the model is the fact that the workers choose their hours and their schedules. I think with the 0 hours contracts, it's the employers who are making those schedules up. We don't have that terminology here. So correct me am I wrong about that? With 0 hours contracts, the employer is allowed to not give any work to the worker, or they can give more work to the worker. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you'd have to make that shift. I mean, parts of it are parts of the model are relevant, which is the difference between the power of a supplemental and a dependent worker is not confined to this sector. So that, I guess that's maybe what you're asking, more the core of what you're asking. This idea really comes from efficiency wage theory in economics, or what came to be called efficiency wage theory. But it's the idea that the cost to the worker of losing the job is really key to how easy it is for the employer to discipline the worker. So when employees have a high cost of job loss, they are much more likely to conform to what the employer wants, work harder, they value the job more. And, just a little anecdote, I worked on, that was, my dissertation was about efficiency wage theory and, my PhD dissertation in economics. And after, moving into sociology, I'd kind of forgotten about all that stuff. And at some point in the middle of the MacArthur grant, I was writing a proposal for another research grant and writing about this supplemental distinction. And then I realized for the first time, it's a variant of efficiency wage theory. Yeah, it hadn't even occurred to me. So our dependence variable is different than the economist's idea of the cost of job loss, because we really are focusing on something very material, which is basic living expenses, and whether the worker needs those needs the platform income to pay for them. In the economist version, it's all about utility, so you could be rich or poor, but it's a similar kind of argument. Sex workers, very interesting. We have talked a lot in the new project about trying to maybe do a case of sex workers.
Okay, Brendan, I don't know if you want to come back in here.
Yeah, no, thank you. It just occurs to me, I mean, very often when the surveys done of zero-hour contracts in the UK, employers' surveys in particular extol their virtues and say how satisfied people are. But I think you really have hit the nail on the head in thinking about, for those people who, when the employer phones them up and says, we want you to work Sunday evening, if they're supplemental workers, they can say, no, thank you, I don't want to work Sunday evening. And that's a great job to have. When you're absolute dependent, not only on getting the money on that Sunday evening, but also worried that the employer won't give you further work as a way of disciplining you if you turn them down, then you're in showing all the characteristics of your dependent workers. I think it really absolutely cuts that a lot of the confusion around the big debates we've had on zero-hour contracts in the UK. Yeah.
So I think one thing that beyond the pro-con debate point is that because so much of the debate was about this is bad, this is good, people, particularly the this is bad folks, really focused on those dependent workers, which is fine. It is bad for the dependent workers, but the debate just for so long missed why it matters that you have this heterogeneity and the heterogeneity itself. To be fair to those folks, I think they had a point, although it wasn't necessarily stated this way, about the evolution of platforms toward more dependent workers. Although we're not exactly sure about that, but we've been trying to look and try and figure it out. The data on who these people are and how it changes over time and stuff in the US is really poor. But there's also the point that the model of the platforms is to have both of those kinds of workers, because they have the supplemental workers as a kind of quote unquote reserve army. When they need more workers, they get them and they pull them in with, typically with higher wages. But it's a kind of reverse reserve army from Marx, which is that these tend to be the more privileged workers, not the more downtrodden in a classic Marxian reserve army.
I think it'd be nice to take a couple of questions on cooperatives. So we've got a couple. Firstly, by Zlatko Bodrovic. Hi, could you say a bit more on the platform cooperatives? What do you think is the key difference between mainstream platforms and platform cooperatives? And then there's another question by Steve Rolfe. How could a worker-owned cooperative compete with venture capital burning companies like Uber and Deliveroo? Are there examples of how platform cooperatives can carve out niches, escaping such intense competitive pressures?
Yeah. So those are great. So the biggest differences, of course, the workers are owning the cooperatives, owning the platforms. They therefore can make sure the algorithms are not working in ways that are really undermining their well-being, number one. they also are able to capture a much larger share of the value of the product. So on our platform cooperative, the artist cooperative, the photographers, I'm forgetting the exact numbers now, but they got a much higher fraction of sale than they did when they worked for the industry, you know, basically the Uber of stock photography, and that's a company called Getty. So they're much happier for that reason. The competition thing is difficult. The platform cooperative was able to survive because it kind of went up market from the industry leader, and it created a sort of more boutique kind of niche. The question even asks about niches. So it had a quirkier style, a little bit of a product differentiation. Now, apparently, the industry leader is trying to copy them. So I think with the food delivery and the ride hailing, and we do see some small cooperatives here on those, of course, the superior financial position of the leaders is a very daunting competitive environment for co-ops. There are two things that they can do. One is by providing much better conditions for the workers, they are able to attract presumably a better workforce. And the big companies have incredible rates of labor attrition. I mean, huge numbers of people sign up for these and drop out because they're so exploitative or other reasons. So one is the labor force, and the other is, I think they have to start with a strategy in which they attract consumers who want to help workers. So there's a growing group of consumers who will be willing to forego the industry leader and the lowest cost. They'll be willing to pay a little bit of a premium, not too much, but a little bit of a premium in order to support something that aligns with their values. And I've done a lot of work on this, with my other more consumer hat. And especially if you start in some cities where you have more of those kinds of populations. So I think that's a marketing niche that these co-ops can go with. The other thing is that I think that we should be starting to push municipal governments to give more support for co-ops, so to narrow a little bit that financing gap, because this is, I think, increasingly understood at the municipal level at least, and maybe in some countries even at the national level, that co-ops are an important part of a development and labor force strategy and so forth. So the co-op we studied was the two things about it that I think really helped. One is it was founded by people in the industry who had long experience. They'd started a company and sold that company to Getty, the industry leader, and they took that money. They made a $1.3 million loan to the new company, the co-op, which they were able to pay back pretty quickly. But so that co-op started with $1 million. And I mean, $1 million is not that much anymore. So, and for a local, for a local delivery or ride hail, you don't need $1 million. But I have a friend, she started, the founder of Zipcar, thinks that the technology requirements for being a successful app or platform firm are higher than the advocates of platform co-ops think they are. So that is one issue, like how do you keep up with the technology? But that's where we're doing a lot in this sector to sort of create platform co-op kits, with kind of ready-made technology that co-ops can use that software. And I think it is getting a lot more regularized than it was when, Uber and Airbnb started.
Okay. We're getting close to time. I think we can run over for a few minutes. So I think it might be quite good to pick out a couple of questions that look more to the future. So there's a question by Kurt Vanderlei. How do you see the development prospects of the platform economy post-COVID-19, given the variable impact of COVID-19 on different platforms? And another question by Joe Ellery. What are some of the key research and social economic needs now and in the future for research about platforms? Big questions.
Let me find that. Okay. Key research now and in the future. Well, I do think that better, surveys, it's a really hard population to survey. But I think that's one of the things we need. In the US, there's still just many questions about who these people are. I know in Europe it's got a lot more. You have more institutional support behind the surveys, but I think that's really key. I think access to the platform data is key, because there are a lot of questions we could answer if we had the platform data, including a lot of those questions about environmental impacts. And that's another. We're just starting to scratch the surface on those, and I think that's really key. And can you remind me the other question?
Yes.
I was just writing something down.
Okay. How do you see the development prospects of the platform economy post-COVID-19, given the variable impact of COVID-19 on different platforms?
Yeah. So it's interesting. Of course, you've had the shifts in demand out of ride hail into food delivery, grocery shopping, the more contactless kinds of platforms have done well. I don't see this. I don't see COVID making if anything, I think we'll see the platform economy expand as a result of COVID. I have been working with a couple of colleagues on a food delivery platform. This is for, it's a food donation platform. It's actually most active in the UK, called Olio. And it has people who get donated food from restaurants and supermarkets and so forth, but also individuals, and then give it free to others. And we're looking at we see a big spike at the beginning of COVID and then a decline, and we're not sure exactly what's going on, but we are trying to study that. I think the other big thing, of course, has been if COVID leads to high unemployment and economic distress, you'll see more people flood onto these platforms, and then you have more competition for the work, downward, race to the bottom. So that's a kind of really negative thing that we see happening already with the food shopping, where just people using bots to get tasks, and other people, long-time food shoppers being unable to get any work. And so it's a kind of Hobbesian dog eat dog out there right now on the platforms. I shouldn't be laughing. It's pretty painful.
Okay, I'm just going to bring in one further colleague. I note that Kate Hardy has offered to send you a paper that she's just written for South Atlantic Quarterly on sex worker platforms. But Kate, I wondered if you'd maybe like to make some comments or ask Juliet a specific question.
Yeah, can I mute myself? Hi, Juliet. Yeah, that was really great. Yeah, it was just making me think from your conversation with Brendan about a paper that we've just written in South Atlantic Quarterly, which was on sex work. And it was kind of trying to think through the similarities and differences to kind of platforms in other areas of the economy. And it made me think about your comment about market making rather than kind of employment, rather than directly shaping employment relations. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that in terms of where the platform kind of intervenes in the market rather than directly in the employment relations.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I was writing down your name and that reference when I missed what Mark was saying. So if you would send me the paper, I'd be really appreciative. Yes, I think that's true. I mean, there has been that dimension of these platforms because they are making new markets or, taking markets that were very marginal and really, mainstreaming them. I guess the question is, I'm not sure what the question about that is. So I think that, I mean, to me, one of the issues is sort of what happens after the market is made and what are the dynamics of it. And that's where I think, if we take ride hail or food delivery as a canonical case, which may be a mistake, I'm not sure, that sort of downward trajectory that I talked about is really key. But it also leaves them vulnerable to regulation because they've gotten so far out of line with, what's considered acceptable in terms of labor conditions. So in New York, for example, ride-hail workers now have a minimum wage, which is, after expenses, $17 an hour, before expenses, $27. There's a cap on vehicles. They have to be licensed. So a lot of the aspects of the platform have been taken away. And we're studying Airbnb regulation, and that's happening all over the country. We're not sure it's effective yet, but really trying to take the commercial operators off the platform. Airbnb is really interesting and different in the sense that both users on both sides of the platform, hosts and guests, are pretty happy with it. And it's the non-users who are suffering the externalities of it, higher rents, reduced rental properties, party houses, etc. So that has a really different impact than some of these other platforms where the conflict between the workers and the platform is more of an issue. And then there's also starting to be more work on platform workers who have a lot more market power. I mean, the thing about this group of platforms that I've been talking about today is these are very generalized skills that large numbers of people have, which means almost anybody can get onto these platforms, which means workers don't have much market power. And that's why that supplemental nature, makes that difference. But where we're talking about doctors and teachers, and I realize teachers don't have a lot at the moment in the United States, but some of these other high skill platforms where I think the dynamics will probably be different than the generalized skill platforms, where that open access just means that threat of downward pressure on wages and working conditions is always there. Let me just say one last point, because it is an analytic point, and then I'll stop. That point, I think, really underscores the importance of thinking about these platforms in the context of the larger labor market. And so much of the early literature, which was so focused on the shiny new thing, thought of them as things in themselves. And so, algorithmic management and so forth were really focused on them just as a kind of ice, almost in a bubble. And, one of the things about our approach, which really ties that whole concept of dependency, means that the larger labor market is really key because, outside options, as the economists would call it, are really important because you've got so much mobility on and off. And so I just, that's also an answer to the question of what else to study, which is the connections between these platforms and the larger labor markets in which they operate.
Okay, thanks, Juliet. I think that's a good point to close. And I think that's a really important point about the connections between platforms and the wider labor market. I think that's been picked up by some other research, but it's a very important point. And I think the point you make, the distinctions you made around dependency, I think are really useful analytically. So thanks for that. I have a few housekeeping points to run through. First off, I should give a formal thank you to Juliet Schor for such a great presentation and for joining us early morning in the States. So thank you very much. I think there was a virtual round of applause. Unfortunately, we can't mimic that in any way. Secondly, as you'll see, there's now a poll come up on the screen inviting feedback on the session. We're very keen to see how we can run these sessions, improve them, run them in a better way. Any feedback, very much appreciated, and I hope you enjoyed today. Naturally, apologies to those colleagues whose questions we didn't put to Juliet directly, but I think we broadly covered all the points raised by most of the questions, since there were slightly different degrees of emphasis in some of them. Next, you can, the ubiquitous plug to our Twitter handle. So you can follow the Digit Research Centre on Twitter at Digit Centre to find out what we're up to and all our forthcoming events. The next Digit Debates seminar will be next Wednesday, I believe, and that'll be Deborah Howcroft. And so there should be a slide on your screen at the moment. Deborah's going to talk to us next Wednesday about a typology of crowd work platforms. So I think that's my housekeeping covered, Gemma, unless there's any more points you want me to cover.
No, that's it, Mark. Thanks very much.
Okay, great. So thanks, Juliet. I hope you found the session useful and the questions useful, and I'm sure everyone who attended had found your talk really interesting. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. No, it was wonderful. Great questions. Great to meet you all. And please be in touch if you're researching this topic and think it would be useful for us to connect.
Okay, great. Okay, bye everybody.